Hello, my name is Chad Helm, and this is my story. I was, born when my parents were 15 and 16 years old. My mother was in and out of my life. My father was in and out of my life. But at 5 years old, I was given back to my father after he married a lady 12 years older than him. And she had already had 2 children. I felt like I was the outcast from the family. To think that my father didn't love me no more. I tried committing suicide at 15 years old. And, that's something that I'm not afraid to talk about. A lot of men tend to hold that in because they're so afraid of what other people will think. But I've realized that in order for me to have total healing, I first off had to become vulnerable and forgive the person who did it to me. So I ended up moving in with my aunt and uncle. At 16 years old, 2 weeks before my 17-year-old birthday, I started selling cars. My first month selling cars, I sold 23 units. They had a Salesman of the Month party for me at the end. They started passing around this plate of a white powdery substance. But as they started snorting lines off this plate, the plate got to me, and I had been looking for that father image, that role model, and I felt like I had to fit in, so I ended up snorting a line, and it was ether-based cocaine. My habit went from once a month to once a week to 7 days a week. Blood would start dripping out of my nose, and my way to medicate that would be to go to the bathroom and snort a line off the back of the toilet. At 19 years old, I was arrested for my first set of crimes. My second week in the penitentiary, I was raped. That's something that still is hard for me to talk about, but once again, that's another thing that I have to talk about to move past. So for a very long time, I was afraid to be touched. I couldn't take enough showers to get clean. I felt dirty. Ended up getting released out of prison, and my grandmother and my aunt had picked me up. Within my first 24 hours of being out, I went right back to my addiction. I wasn't doing nothing to change. My addiction's the only thing that would numb me and to help me escape the reality of life. I ended up catching a new set of charges a couple years later. On my last day of being incarcerated, I was scared to leave. Jail and prison are 2 places I felt safe at. I was able to be clean and sober, obviously, because it's a lot harder to get drugs or alcohol inside. When it was time for me to get released, I went to assault a staff member to try to get more time. Left that same day. They didn't give me more time. They restrained me, handcuffed me until it was time for me to totally walk out. I started using once again the same day that I left. I was able to hide my addiction for a couple months. I've always lived in this dark world. I knew who God was. I knew there was a God. I believed in God. And the crazy thing is, even during my addiction, I still would go to church. And my pastor, he had shared his story one night to the youth group, and his story really impacted my life. So I fell in love with this church, and I fell in love with his story and with Jesus Christ. But part of me was not willing to surrender my all, and so I continued to follow my way and my will of life, which, like I said before, it led me down to the path of destruction, and my life became a living hell. On 10/10 of 2015, when I was planning on committing suicide, I had written my suicide letters to family members. My plan was to do enough heroin and cocaine to either have a heart attack or to overdose. I ended up getting pulled over for my license plate light being burnt out. And I was on Bluetooth talking to my mother at the time, and remind you, she's 2 hours away from where I was. And I was telling my mom my goodbyes at this time, telling her this is gonna be the last time that she talks to me. I had told my mother, you need to hang up the phone because you're gonna hear something you don't wanna hear. And my plan, right when I saw the lights and heard the sirens, is I'm gonna make this cop shoot me. And it's the insanity that we live whenever we're in active addiction or even just living in this dark world. We do the same things over and over. We expect a different result, but we keep getting the same thing. Obviously they run the plates and they see your name, and he saw that I was a habitual criminal, and I came up in their system as armed and dangerous. I told this officer that he's not searching my car that he's gonna have to shoot me in order to get into the car. And I just started screaming, "Shoot me." My mother's on the other end of this phone on the Bluetooth hearing all of this go on. And she's crying and screaming at the time for me to stop. At that point in time, he tried to reach into my car and pull me out of or unlock the vehicle, or to pull me out. I'm not really for sure what he was trying to do. I ended up rolling his arm up in the window as I took off in a high-speed chase. They clocked me going 141 miles per hour. And this officer, though, that I had rolled his arm up in the window, he was able to get free shortly after I took off. My car spun out. I ended up coming to a stop about 2 feet from these officers in their vehicle. One of them came, they busted out my window, pulled me out of the vehicle. And as I was laying there on the ground, I looked over, and as my face was smashed into the rocks and they were cuffing me, there was one officer that stood out, and he looked at me. He didn't have his gun drawn, he just stared at me. That officer that didn't draw a gun on me, he came up to the jail cell. He said, "Mr. Helm," he said, "you don't belong here, you're better than this." He said, "Just surrender." About 3 days later, that same officer comes back. He says, "Mr. Helm, have you surrendered?" You know, I saw these different inmates reading the Bible, and, you know, I've always heard that that's jailhouse religion, that you're just doing this to get out of trouble, that these are foxhole prayers. I asked him, I said, "Why do you keep coming to me? Why do you care so much about me?" And this officer introduced himself. He said, "Well," he says, "I'm the chief deputy of police of this town." He said, "My name is Gary Carroll." And he says, "I know God has something in store for you." And he says, "You just got to surrender." He says, "I just arrested my own son a couple days ago going through the same exact stuff that you're going through." And he said, "Me looking at you is like looking at my own child." Well, after we talked for a minute, that officer walks away, and that night I got on my knees in my cell. My cellmate was asleep. And I said, "Father, let thy will be done, not my way. My way is death, your way is life. I can't do this on my own." And at that point in time, a seed was planted in me. And I knew I had to change, but I didn't know if I was ready. I was still scared. And my name gets called to pack my stuff, that I was being discharged. I said, "There's no way." I thought I was hearing something. Because my charges that were racked up, I was facing 6 to 30 years due to me being a habitual criminal, and due to me assaulting an officer, the high-speed chase, possession of narcotics, manufacturing, intent to deliver. There were so many charges that were charged up against me. There's no way. My bond was $50,000 full cash. I grab my things real quick and I walk out, the front door of the jail, and my mother's standing there with the chief deputy of police, with the founder of Release Through Jesus Prison Ministries, and my sister. You would think that that was going to be the day that I would change, but I didn't. So I decided to get a plane ticket, that I was going to go to treatment in Florida. My dad calls me, and he says, "Son," he says, "if you want me back in your life," he says, "I want you to go to rehab, to long term." I ended up flying to treatment. I graduated the program, and I was in Florida in a sober living house. Well, it just so happened the sober living house that I went to turned out to be a flop house. And there was nothing but using. The owner used. So within 2 days, I was back to getting high. I started catching new charges in Florida. I started forging checks. I hated who I had become. When I looked myself in the mirror, I looked like death. I was nothing but flesh and bone. I eventually ended up getting involved in human trafficking in Florida. And that was to support my addiction and my lifestyle. And I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I didn't know how to stop. Eventually ended up moving to Kentucky. I got involved with methamphetamines. I was a heroin addict and cocaine addict for almost 8 years. Then I started doing methamphetamines whenever I got here. I became this very demonic and this very hateful and cold-hearted person. Still, a part of me wanted to change, but I didn't know how to stop. I became addicted to money. I became a sex addict. I became addicted to having control. On 7/27 of 2018, narcotic officers raided my home, put my hands up, and I got on the floor. I felt relieved, like I didn't have to run no more. They told me that I was definitely going away for a long time. I started feeling my heart sputter, and I was ODing. The drugs that I had ingested, finally the bag broke in my stomach. I remember waking up in the hospital with a tube down my throat. I had found out that my kidneys and liver and everything had started to shut down. I don't know how, but my mother was able to call to the phone. She says, "Son, it's time." And I started crying. I said, "What do you mean it's time, Mom?" She says, "Aren't you sick and tired of being sick and tired?" I said, "Yes, I am." And I hung up the phone. And when I hung up the phone, I remember this is the part that gets me. I remember saying, God, this isn't a foxhole prayer. That if you deliver me out of this situation, that I will give you my all. I will surrender my life to you, and I will be a servant for your kingdom. I remember after they did my intake, they reeled me in and literally dumped me into a medical unit cell with concrete floor, 4 concrete walls, stainless steel toilet, steel bed, and a 1/2-inch thick mat. And I remember hollering at the officer. I said, wait a minute, I can't walk. How am I supposed to get up to use the bathroom? What am I supposed to do? I remember laying on this stainless steel slab, looking up at the ceiling. I remember my attorney coming to talk to me that same day. And he says, "Chad, I'm afraid I got some bad news for you." He said, "They want you to do 22 years at 80%. He says, "Well, Chad," he says, "you know, with your criminal record, you're PFO eligible, which means persistent felony offender. And he says the likelihood of you getting less than 15 to 18 is not looking too possible." I said, "I prayed about it. It's going to be okay." And my public defender honestly laughed at me at the time, and he left. So from that point on, from that day, even inside 4 walls, I found a freedom. And that was because I had finally surrendered my way of life and my will to God's way and to His will. And I started being a servant right where I was at, and that was inside them jail walls. I kept remembering the story, chapter 6, of the story of Daniel and Daniel in the lion's den. And at that point, I made up my mind that I'm Daniel, and God's got me, and He will get me through this. And just like He can get anyone else through anything that they're going through. I remember inmates coming back to because my bunk was towards the back of the unit. I remember being able to share my testimony with them and to be able to look them in the eyes with a pure heart and sincerity, and the glow that you have whenever you finally surrender your life and you start living in God's will. People can see that. At least 4 to 5 guys per week were rotating in and out of the unit. I had to stay because I was a maximum security inmate, and they couldn't put me in different units. But I remember different lives getting saved, different guys coming back and praying with me, asking me to lead them to Christ. And I knew I had a purpose. My father came back into my life, and so did my uncle. And they hired me a paid attorney. That attorney fought for me. I got reclassified to a minimum security inmate. The paid attorney that I had got some of my charges reduced, and they ended up transferring me down the hall to the Hope Center program. I ended up getting to the end of the Hope Center program, went in front of this judge, Judge Bunnell, and I got up and I just looked at her in the eyes, and I said, "Your Honor, I'm not the same person I was when I came into this place. If you give me a chance, I promise I won't let you down." She pulled some papers that she had out of a folder. And my father My mother, my aunt, my grandma, and my uncle had all written letters on my behalf and sent emails on my behalf. They had been fighting for me this whole entire time. The same people who I had hurt through the last 15 years of my life were the same people that stuck by me. The judge paused and said, "I'm gonna give you a chance." And I went from facing 22 years at 80% to being sentenced to drug court probation. I about dropped my knees in the courtroom, but I knew it was because God knew my heart, and He knew that I finally meant what I said, that I wasn't just going through the emotions. I'm not saying that God will deliver us out of every fire, because sometimes He wants to walk through that fire with us. I'm now coming up I'm close to 2 years clean and sober of any mind-altering controlled substance or alcohol. And I now am able to go into some of these jails and speak to inmates. The same officers that raided my home are the same officers that I now get to do interventions with for other addicts that are suffering and for families that are going through the same thing. The same officers that raided my home and put me in handcuffs are the same officers who I now get to sit next to in the church. So I challenge you, if you're going through something today, become vulnerable and be willing and let somebody help you. Don't suffer in silence.